In occupied France in 1943, silence was often more dangerous than gunfire. Radios were scarce, easily tracked, and deadly when discovered. Written messages, if intercepted, could condemn entire villages. Within this fragile reality, the French resistance relied on methods that felt outdated but proved essential. Among them were horses used, not for combat, but for communication. In the hills and rural corridors where roads were watched and fuel was rationed, horses became a lifeline that technology could no longer guarantee. One such horse, documented in resistance records from southern France, was used repeatedly to move sealed messages between cells, operating miles apart. The animal's name was never formally recorded, a deliberate choice meant to protect identities if documents were seized. What mattered was not recognition, but reliability. The horse traveled familiar agricultural routes, guided by couriers who blended into the landscape as farmhands or traders. To German patrols, the sight was unremarkable. That ordinariness was its greatest protection. The messages carried were brief, coded, and irreplaceable. They detailed troop movements, supply transfers, and scheduled inspections. Some warned of impending raids. Others confirmed the success or failure of sabotage operations coordinated with Allied intelligence. Each delivery carried moral weight. A delayed message could cost lives. A misstep could unravel entire networks. The horse moved without knowing the stakes, yet every step shaped outcomes beyond any battlefield. German forces controlled railways and major roads, but rural paths remained unpredictable. Fuel shortages, limited vehicle use, and bicycles raised suspicion when used repeatedly on the same routes. Horses, however, fit the rhythm of the countryside. They could travel at night without engines or lights, guided by instinct and familiarity. Resistance couriers trusted the animal's calm more than their own nerves. Panic, they knew, was often louder than fear. For the men and women who relied on this system, the horse represented more than transport. It was continuity in a world fractured by occupation. Couriers wrote later that they felt a strange sense of stability riding those routes, as if normal life briefly resumed. Fields, fences, and villages remained unchanged, even as authorities shifted violently around them. The horse moved through that contradiction effortlessly. By late 1943, Allied planners increasingly depended on local intelligence to prepare for future operations in Western Europe. Messages carried by animals like this one fed into larger strategic pictures assembled far from the countryside where they originated. The courier would hand off a sealed packet, receive no acknowledgement, and turn back immediately. There were no celebrations, only repetition. As winter approached, patrols intensified, and arrests increased. Each journey carried greater risk, and the margin for error narrowed. Yet the horse continued its routes, unnoticed and indispensable. Somewhere along those paths, a single message still, undelivered, waited to cross enemy-controlled land, carrying consequences far beyond the quiet sound of hooves on frozen soil. By early 1944, the resistance network in southern France had learned a difficult truth. Survival depended on predictability, disguised as routine. The horse used for message transport followed routes that appeared ordinary but were chosen with extreme care. These paths wound through vineyards, grazing fields, and narrow tree-lined lanes where movement looked agricultural rather than strategic. For German patrols trained to spot urgency, the absence of haste was often enough to avoid attention. The couriers who rode these routes were rarely the same twice in a row. Resistance leaders rotated riders to reduce patterns, but the horse remained constant. Its familiarity with the terrain mattered more than speed. It knew where the ground soft after rain, where stones loosened on inclines, where fences could be passed without noise. Couriers later described how the animal would slow instinctively near checkpoints long before human senses detected danger. Messages were concealed with precision. Some were sewn into saddle padding. Others were hidden inside hollowed leather straps or sealed in wax-lined containers tied beneath the belly, invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. The horse carried nothing openly suspicious. If stopped, the rider could dismount, present forged papers, and appear indistinguishable from a civilian tending livestock. The animal, calm and still, reinforced the illusion. German counterintelligence reports from the region show increasing frustration during this period. Raids produced few results. Radios were occasionally seized, but key resistance cells remained operational. Historians later linked this resilience to low-tech communication methods that left little trace. Horses required no fuel, emitted no signals, and left behind no intercepted transmissions. Their effectiveness lay in their simplicity. For the couriers, each journey carried psychological strain. The absence of immediate danger did not reduce fear, it prolonged it. Hours passed in silence, broken only by distant engines or voices on the road. Riders were trained never to rush, even when they suspected pursuit. A sudden change in pace invited scrutiny. Trusting the horse meant surrendering control, a difficult discipline for people living under constant threat. Some messages delivered during this time proved decisive. Intelligence about troop rotations and supply shortages was passed along to Allied contacts. Via layered channels, the courier would deliver a packet to a farmhouse, where another member would take it further by foot or bicycle. No one saw the entire chain. That fragmentation protected everyone, including the horse, whose role remained known only to a handful. As spring approached, anticipation spread quietly through resistance circles. Rumors of a major Allied landing circulated, though details were scarce. Communication became more urgent, yet caution increased. The horse continued its routes, bearing messages that hinted at preparations still unseen. Each successful delivery reinforced a fragile confidence. Something was coming, and until it arrived, silence carried patiently across occupied land remained the Resistance's most powerful weapon. By late spring of 1944, pressure on the Resistance intensified across occupied France. German patrols increased in frequency. Checkpoints shifted without warning, and familiar roads were suddenly closed. What had once been routine routes became unpredictable overnight. For the couriers, this meant recalculating every journey. For the horse, it meant relying even more on memory paths learned through repetition rather than instruction. The system had worked because it blended into normal life. Now, normal life was shrinking. One delivery in particular stood out in post-war testimonies. The message originated near a rail junction frequently used to move German supplies north. Intelligence suggested an imminent transfer of equipment, information urgently needed by Allied planners. Radio transmission was ruled out immediately. Too many signals had already been detected that month. The decision was made to move the message by horse, despite the increased risk. Delay was considered more dangerous than exposure. The courier assigned that night later recalled how quiet the countryside felt. Not peaceful, empty. Villages were dark earlier than usual, and fields that once held workers stood abandoned. The horse sensed the change. It moved cautiously, ears alert, adjusting its pace without command. Near a bend in the road known to be lightly guarded, it slowed unexpectedly. Moments later, distant voices confirmed the presence of a patrol that had not been there days before. The courier dismounted and waited, trusting the animal's instinct over any map. They avoided detection, but the route ahead was compromised. Turning back was not an option. The message could not remain where it was. A decision had to be made: risk an unfamiliar path or delay delivery until daylight, when movement would appear more natural but exposure higher. The courier chose the former. The horse was guided into terrain it had rarely crossed, relying less on memory and more on calm responsiveness. Each step forward carried uncertainty. What made this system effective was also what made it fragile. No single person held complete knowledge. The courier did not know how the information would be used. The recipient would not know how it had traveled. The horse moved between fragments of a larger design, unaware of the stakes, yet essential to them. That night, the fragility of the network became clear. One mistake would not merely end a mission, it could unravel trust built over months. The delivery succeeded just before dawn. The message passed hands without acknowledgement, folded into another layer of secrecy. Only later would its significance be understood. It contributed to adjustments in Allied planning that reduced exposure during supply disruptions weeks later. The courier never learned those details. The horse returned quietly to its stable, fed and rested, as if the night had been unremarkable. Yet something had changed. The Resistance understood that their margin for invisibility was narrowing. Every successful delivery now carried the weight of how close failure had come. As rumors of a massive Allied operation grew stronger, the horse's next journey would not merely carry information, it would test whether this silent method could survive the final tightening of enemy control. In early June of 1944, tensions settled over the French countryside like a low fog. Resistance cells sensed a turning point approaching, though few knew its shape or timing. Allied broadcasts hinted at preparation, not confirmation. Orders became shorter, more urgent, and more cautious at the same time. Communication failures at this stage could compromise months of planning. Within that fragile balance, the horse messenger system remained active, though its role grew increasingly perilous. One final series of messages stood out in later archival reconstructions. These communications focused on rail activity, fuel shortages, and troop movements shifting westward. Individually, the details seemed minor. Together, they formed patterns that Allied intelligence analysts depended upon to confirm readiness for a large-scale operation. The resistance understood only part of this picture. What they knew was that delivery timing mattered more than ever. The horse was prepared quietly, without ceremony. Couriers avoided visible urgency, even as pressure mounted internally. Saddles were checked repeatedly. Concealments adjusted with precision learned through experience rather than instruction. Every choice reflected accumulated caution. Routes were altered slightly. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to reduce predictability. The horse adapted without resistance, responding to subtle changes in handling that signaled unfamiliar paths ahead. That night's journey unfolded under unusual stillness. No vehicles passed for long stretches. Patrols, when encountered, were tense but distracted, focused on orders moving down the chain rather than rural surveillance. The courier later described a sense of suspended time, as if the countryside itself were holding breath. The horse moved steadily, unhurried, maintaining the illusion of routine that had protected them before. At one checkpoint, the courier was briefly questioned. Papers were examined, questions asked without aggression. The horse stood calm, shifting weight only once, lowering its head as if accustomed to delay. The interaction ended without escalation. Only after distance had been gained did the courier realize how narrowly exposure had been avoided. The message remained undetected, but the margin had been thin. Delivery occurred just before dawn at a farmhouse that had served as a relay point for months. The exchange was silent. No confirmation was offered. The courier turned back immediately, retracing a separate route as instructed. The horse's role ended not with acknowledgement, but with continuation. Another movement folded into routine. Within days, Allied forces would land on the Normandy coast. The messages carried during those final weeks contributed to a broader intelligence picture that shaped operational decisions. The horse did not cross beaches or witness combat. Its impact lay elsewhere, embedded in preparation rather than action. As events accelerated beyond the countryside, the resistance knew their quiet system would soon change or disappear entirely. One last journey still remained, and it would carry more than information. The days following the Allied landings in Normandy did not bring immediate relief to the countryside of southern France. Instead, uncertainty deepened. German forces tightened control over inland routes, aware that local intelligence had failed them but unsure how. Patrols multiplied. Questioning became more frequent. The resistance understood that their window for movement was closing, yet information remained urgently needed. The horse messenger system, once discreet, now operated under growing strain. Messages carried during this period reflected rapid change. Reports described confused troop redeployments, disrupted rail schedules, and shortages spreading unevenly across regions. For Allied planners, such details helped assess how effectively the landings had fractured German coordination. For the resistance, delivering this information became a matter of timing rather than secrecy alone. Delay reduced relevance. Speed increased risk. The balance was narrowing. The horse undertook fewer journeys now, but each carried greater significance. Couriers were instructed to abort missions at the first sign of irregularity. Preservation of the network mattered more than completion. This shift marked a psychological turning point. Earlier deliveries emphasized and now restraint became a form of discipline. Knowing when not to ride mattered as much as knowing the routes themselves. One post-landing delivery illustrates this tension clearly. A message detailing emergency troop transfers through secondary roads needed confirmation beyond radio reach. The horse was chosen because its previous routes had remained largely untouched. Yet along the way, the courier encountered multiple checkpoints within short distance and abnormal pattern. Proceeding further risked exposure that could compromise future operations. The courier chose to turn back, a decision later supported by resistance leadership. That choice carried emotional weight. Couriers had been trained to complete missions despite fear. Turning back felt like failure, even when ordered. The horse returned to its stable without incident, unaware that restraint had prevented detection. That undelivered message would be rerouted days later through alternate channels. Survival of the system depended on such decisions, rarely acknowledged and never celebrated. As Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy, the role of rural intelligence began to change. The need shifted from long-term planning to immediate coordination. Radios slowly returned to limited use. Physical couriers transitioned to short-range tasks. The horse's journeys became less frequent, its role gradually diminishing without formal conclusion. There was no final mission, no symbolic ending, only a quiet reduction in necessity. For those who had relied on the animal, this transition felt strangely anticlimactic. Months of silent movement gave way to visible liberation that arrived unevenly and violently elsewhere. The horse remained part of the countryside, its contribution absorbed into outcomes it would never witness. Yet the resistance understood something important. Victory was not only forged on beaches or in cities, it was prepared in silence, along narrow paths where information moved patiently, one step at a time. By late summer of 1944, the landscape of occupied France was changing rapidly. Allied advances from Normandy disrupted German command structures, forcing hurried withdrawals and uneven defenses. For the resistance, this created a paradox. Opportunity expanded, but danger intensified. Retreating forces were unpredictable, and desperation often replaced procedure. In this unstable environment, the quiet systems that had sustained resistance communication for years faced their final test. The horse messenger system was among those systems. What had once been a reliable method of avoiding detection now risked exposure. Through sheer visibility, roads that were previously ignored became crowded with movement troops, refugees, and displaced civilians. Normal patterns dissolved. The strength of the horse had always been its ability to blend into routine. As routine vanished, so did its protection. Resistance leadership began issuing new guidance. Physical message transport would be limited to essential confirmations only. Intelligence now flowed more directly toward advancing Allied units, often through improvised channels. Radios reappeared cautiously. Face-to-face coordination replaced long-distance secrecy. The horse, once indispensable, became a liability if used without restraint. This transition was not framed as an ending, but as adaptation, another survival decision shaped by circumstance. One of the last documented journeys occurred during this period of transition. A brief message confirming the abandonment of a German supply route needed delivery to a nearby coordination point. The route was short, familiar, and judged manageable. The horse carried the courier without incident, moving through terrain that now bore signs of disruption-damaged rail lines, abandoned equipment, and civilians watching events unfold with guarded hope. The delivery succeeded quietly, as so many had before. After that, instructions changed. No further long-range rides were authorized. The horse remained stabled, cared for by locals who understood its value without fully knowing its history. There was no ceremony marking the shift. The system ended not with exposure or loss, but with victory. When it approaches, often dissolves the methods that sustained the struggle. For couriers, the emotional adjustment was unexpected. Riding had provided purpose during uncertainty. Standing down felt unnatural, even unsafe. The horse's calm presence, once associated with danger, now symbolized waiting. It stood as it always had, steady, responsive, unremarkable to anyone unaware of its role. That ordinariness had always been its strength. As liberations spread unevenly across regions, attention moved elsewhere to rebuild in accountability and memory. The horse did not feature in reports or celebrations. Its contribution was absorbed into outcomes measured in maps and movements, yet for those who had relied on it, the understanding was clear. This animal had carried more than messages. It had carried continuity when coordination seemed impossible. With the network fading into history, one question lingered quietly among former resistance members. How many outcomes depended on actions that would never be recorded? The answer, like the horse's service, remained unspoken, present in results, absent from recognition, and with that silence, the story entered its final phase, shaped not by urgency, but by memory. When liberation reached much of southern France, the mechanisms of resistance dissolved faster than anyone expected. Networks built on secrecy were no longer necessary, and many were intentionally dismantled to protect those who had survived them. Records were destroyed. Routes were abandoned. The horse messenger system disappeared into ordinary rural life, leaving little trace beyond memory. What had once been essential now blended back into the countryside it had quietly served. Former couriers returned to civilian identities with mixed emotions. Some felt relief. Others felt a strange loss of purpose. During occupation, every journey had meaning, even when its outcome was unknown. After liberation, meaning became diffuse. Reconstruction replaced resistance, and urgency gave way to uncertainty. The horse remained present through this transition, stabled and cared for, its role reduced to that of a farm animal once again. No one outside a small circle understood what it had carried. Historians later noted how easily such systems vanished from official accounts. Communication methods that left no paperwork and relied on living memory were difficult to document. Unlike radios or weapons, a horse left no serial number tied to its mission. Its effectiveness lay precisely in its anonymity. That anonymity, however, made recognition unlikely. The animal's contributions survived only in fragmented testimonies recorded years later, often as secondary detail rather than central fact. For those who had depended on the system, the absence of acknowledgement felt expected rather than unjust. Resistance members rarely sought recognition. Survival had required invisibility, and many preferred it afterward. Yet some reflected privately on how close failure had come, and how much depended on choices that would never appear in archives. The horse's calm endurance became, in memory, a symbol of those unseen margins where history often turns. As post-war France rebuilt its infrastructure, roads were repaved and rail lines restored. The same paths, once used to avoid patrols, now carried commerce and daily life. The transformation was swift. Within a few years, the landscape no longer reflected occupation. The horse aged quietly during this period, cared for by locals who understood only that it had once been useful during the war. No ceremonies marked its service. No markers recorded its routes. Yet the impact of those journeys persisted indirectly. Intelligence gathered through low-tech systems like this one had fed into Allied assessments during critical phases of the war. Outcomes attributed to strategy and force were shaped, in part, by information that arrived without signal or sound. The horse's contribution existed within that chain, inseparable from larger events, yet individually untraceable. As memory replaced urgency, one final question emerged for those who remembered. How many victories rely on methods that history cannot easily record? The answer lay not in documents, but in outcomes already achieved. The horse did not need acknowledgement to have mattered. Its service was complete, absorbed into a peace that arrived quietly, much like the messages it once carried across occupied land. In the years following the war, the story of the horse messenger existed almost entirely outside official history. As governments rebuilt and nations redefined themselves, attention shifted toward treaties, trials, and reconstruction. Quiet systems of survival, those that left no formal trail, faded quickly from public consciousness. For the former members of the resistance, memory became the only archive. What had once been operational necessity transformed into personal recollection, fragile and easily lost. Some couriers attempted to record their experiences years later, often prompted by historians, seeking to understand how communication survived under occupation. In these accounts, the horse appeared not as a hero, but as a constant. Writers described its calm temperament, its familiarity with terrain, and its instinctive responses to danger. The animal was never named. Anonymity, once protection, now complicated remembrance. Without names, stories blurred together, difficult to verify yet consistent in detail. Academic studies of resistance logistics eventually acknowledged the role of animals, particularly in rural regions where technology failed. Horses, mules, and carts were identified as essential to maintaining supply lines and message delivery when fuel shortages and surveillance made vehicles impractical. Intelligence assessments depend on accumulation rather than singular reports. The horse's journeys fed into that accumulation, invisible but influential. As decades passed, public interest in the resistance grew. Museums, memorials, and documentaries sought to humanize the occupation years. Some mentioned animals briefly, often as footnotes. For those who had relied on them, this partial recognition felt sufficient. The goal had never been commemoration. It had been survival. Still, the absence of detail underscored how history prioritizes what can be easily documented. The horse itself did not live long into peacetime. It died quietly, its end unrecorded beyond local memory. There were no markers, no preserved equipment. What remained were paths that no longer needed secrecy, and people who carried fragments of a story they rarely told. The Animal Service concluded not with acknowledgement, but with disappearance absorbed fully into the normal life it had helped restore. In that sense, the horse's legacy mirrored the resistance itself. Effective because it blended in, powerful because it avoided notice, remembered not through monuments, but through outcomes already achieved. As historians continued to reconstruct the war's hidden systems, this story remained incomplete and essential. One chapter remained unwritten, waiting not for discovery, but for understanding. As historians continued to reassess the hidden mechanics of World War II, a pattern became increasingly clear. Some of they were most effective tools left the least evidence behind. Intelligence files, after-action reports, and strategic summaries rarely captured how information first moved through occupied territory. The horse messenger system belonged to this invisible layer. Its success depended on silence, repetition, and anonymity, qualities that worked against formal documentation once the war ended. In post-war interviews conducted decades later, former resistance members spoke cautiously about these methods. Many accounts were fragmented, shaped by time and deliberate restraint. Still, similarities emerged. Horses were used where radios failed, where roads were watched, and where fuel shortages made vehicles impractical. They were chosen not for speed, but for plausibility. A rider on a horse looked ordinary. That ordinariness was strategic. German patrols were trained to detect urgency, not routine. Military historians examining Allied intelligence before and after the Normandy landings noted how local reports often arrived with remarkable consistency. Despite disrupted communication lines, while few reports specified delivery methods, analysts inferred low technology solutions operating below detection thresholds. The horse in this story fits squarely within that inferred framework. Its journeys did not change strategy alone, but they helped sustain a flow of confirmation that planners relied upon. The challenge for historians was attribution. Intelligence is cumulative. No single message carries decisive weight by itself. The value lies in patterns, repetition, and corroboration. The horse's role existed within that collective process. It was never meant to stand out. Ironically, that effectiveness ensured it would remain unnamed. Recognition requires distinction. Resistance required invisibility. As academic interest in resistance logistics grew, scholars increasingly emphasized the ethical dimension of such systems. Couriers faced constant moral pressure: proceed and risk exposure, or delay and risk The horse, got calm and unburdened by consequence, enabled those decisions without amplifying risk. Its presence reduced noise, suspicion, and unpredictability. In that sense, it shaped outcomes indirectly by stabilizing choices made under extreme uncertainty. By the time official histories began addressing these hidden systems, most participants were gone. Memory had become selective, shaped by what could be proven. The horse's contribution remained largely yet absence of documentation did not imply absence of impact. The war's outcome rested on countless such margins, where survival depended on methods never intended for recognition. As the historical record slowly expanded to include these realities, one truth emerged clearly. Not all victories are visible, some are carried quietly, step by step, across ground no one thought to record. The horse's final role was not in movement, but in what it represented: a reminder that the most reliable forces in war are often those that leave the faintest trace. One final chapter remained, not of action, but of meaning. When the war finally ended, and Europe began the long process of recovery, the systems that had sustained resistance faded almost completely from public view. Attention turned to treaties, trials, and reconstruction. The quiet methods, those that relied on discretion rather than force, were rarely mentioned. The horse that carried messages across occupied land left no formal trace in victory reports, yet its role was embedded within outcomes already secured. Its impact existed not in headlines, but in continuity. Historians later emphasized that World War II was not won solely through overwhelming force, but through sustained coordination under extreme constraints. Intelligence that arrived reliably, even when technology failed, shaped decisions long before armies moved. The horse messenger system represented this principle in its purest form. It required no innovation, only trust and methods that blended into ordinary life. That ordinariness was its strength, allowing information to move when nothing else could. For former resistance members, the end of the war brought mixed emotions. Relief was immediate. Recognition was not expected. Many believed that seeking acknowledgement would undermine the very secrecy that had protected others. The horse's service became a shared understanding rather than a public story. Its memory passed quietly between those who had depended on it, often mentioned only in passing, as if drawing attention felt unnecessary. Over time, academic studies of occupation-era logistics grew more nuanced. Scholars acknowledged that resistance relied on layered systems, tech and low-tech, working in parallel. Horses, carts, and foot couriers filled gaps that radios and vehicles could not. The animal in this story was never singled out, yet it stood as a representative example of a broader reality. History rarely records every contributor. Instead, it preserves patterns, and within those patterns, this horse belonged. The absence of a name did not diminish significance. Anonymity had been essential to survival, and it remained part of the legacy. The horse was not a symbol of heroism in the traditional sense. It did not charge into danger or receive decoration. Its contribution was measured in reliability, calm, and repetition, qualities often overlooked, yet decisive under pressure. As memory replaced immediacy, the meaning of such contributions became clearer. Wars are not sustained by singular acts alone, but by systems that hold under strain. The horse carried messages, but more importantly, it carried trust between couriers, between cells, and ultimately between local resistance and Allied command. That trust allowed coordination to persist when disruption was constant. In the end, the story of this horse is not about recognition delayed or denied. It is about impact understood quietly. The war moved on, nations rebuilt, and the countryside returned to normal life. Along those paths, no markers remain, yet outcomes shaped by unseen effort endure. The horse's journey ended without ceremony, absorbed into peace. And in that silence, its role found its truest measure not in what was remembered, but in what was achieved.